Shri Vijay Gokhleji, our distinguished guests, deans, directors, faculty, and last but not least, our numerous current and former students. This afternoon's lecture, titled How China Sees the World, is part of the Golden Jubilee Lecture Series, an initiative that was launched by Dr. Vidya Yeravlikar to commemorate 50 years of symbiosis. In the last few years, and particularly in the last few months, China has inadvertently become central to discourse in almost all realms, be it then economic, geopolitical, socio-cultural, and most recently, even in the realm of health security. This lecture by the former Foreign Secretary of India, who is also an expert on China, comes in at the most opportune moment. Without further ado, I will now request Dr. Vidya Yeravlikar to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
So thank you, Shiv. And this is yet another lecture of the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture series, which was launched last month, I think in July. The first lecture was taken by Dr. Mashelkar sir as the inaugural lecture of the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture series. As Shivali rightly said, Symbiosis, which was established by Dr. Muzumdar sir in 1971, has entered its Golden Jubilee year. And we thought that during this pandemic, when everything is closed and shut down, what better way can we engage our students and faculty members and even our well-wishers with such a lecture series of eminent people? The last speakers that have addressed in the Golden Jubilee lecture series are, as I said, Dr. Mashelkar sir, who inaugurated this Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture series. Then we also had Javed Akhtar ji, who spoke on cinema and society. We had Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, who spoke on how to mitigate this crisis and how does one look at the positivity and the opportunities ahead. In fact, while she was addressing, she herself had turned COVID positive just a day before, but yet she carried on, and what a wonderful example of her own self. Then, of course, we had Saurav Ganguly, who spoke very well on leadership and crisis. And now, sir, we have you. Just before you, we had Shri Amitabh Kant, the CEO of Niti Aayog. And now we have someone as an erudite speaker, a writer, and a person who knows the A to Z of China. So we have Shri Vijay Gokhleji address all of us today. Sir, as you see, there are participants, which are students and faculty members and our well-wishers, including the media, who have not just joined on this Zoom platform, but thousands of them who are on YouTube Live, who are listening to us. There will be question and answer session followed by a lecture from students. The whole idea of the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture series was to have people like you, eminent personalities like you, come and speak on a variety of issues and topics that the student should know of. So we in Symbiosis believe that students should get education and not training. So students should not just get the skilling part of the education, but also an overview of what's happening all around the world. And when we look at the development of leadership, leaders are ones who don't have just a tunnel view, but have a holistic knowledge of almost everything. And they are the ones who can then think of out of the box, can be team players, and can think differently in times of crisis and find different solutions to problems. And therefore, subjects as varied as post-COVID reimagining what our national and global scene would be, to cinema and society, to building a new India. And now today, you're going to speak about China and specifically how China looks at the world. So it's going to be a very, very interesting session today. And we know that, you will make it very interesting. And we are, in fact, looking forward to the questions from the students. We all know, of course, that China is widely discussed in the media and in the newspapers, but you are going to give a totally different perspective, is what you also told me, and Shivali also. So without taking more of your time, I welcome you once again, sir, for this Symbiosis Golden Jubilee lecture today. And I'm sure our students are going to be inspired by your talk. Over to you, Shivali.
Thank you, ma'am. I will now request our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. Majumdar sir, to deliver the welcome address.
Today's distinguished speaker, Sri Vijay Gokhaleji, Namaste.
Namaste.
In 1971, to bring foreign and Indian students together to solve the problems of foreign students. And initially it was Symbiosis International Cultural Center. Over a period of time, this concept of symbiosis, which has the motto of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, flowered into an international university. When we started symbiosis, our aim was to bring foreign and Indian students together and promote international understanding. And therefore, you will find that internationalization is the DNA of symbiosis. And therefore, we try to promote international understanding through quality education. I do feel that internationalization of higher education and interculturalization should go hand in hand. And sometimes I would like to say that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a spiritual river which flows through the banks of internationalization or globalization on the one hand and culturalization. And this has been our effort in the university to produce all global citizens through good quality education. We promote Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam concept. And therefore, I am very glad that you have been traveling all over the world. You know various countries, their cultures, and therefore you will appreciate the concept of symbiosis and our efforts to promote international cultures and cultural concept through education. I am very happy that you have spared your time to talk to our students, professors, and with these words, I thank you once again for coming over here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Before I invite our distinguished speaker for this afternoon to deliver his address, I'm going to take just a minute to introduce him. Sri Vijay Gokhaleji, known for his deft diplomacy skills and his knowledge of China, which includes fluency in Mandarin Chinese, played a very important and crucial role to diffuse the Doklam crisis in 2017. A diplomat with a career that has spanned over 3 decades, has served in Hong Kong, Hanoi, New York, and Beijing. He has served as Joint Secretary East Asia and Secretary Economic Relations at the headquarters of the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi. Sri Gokhaleji has served as High Commissioner of Malaysia, Ambassador to Germany, and finally, Ambassador to the People's Republic of China before he was appointed Foreign Secretary in January 2018. I would like to add here that Sri Gokhaleji is no stranger to symbiosis. In 2018, he inaugurated our annual International Relations Conference and delivered an insightful keynote address on shaping India's strategic culture, a speech that has resonated and remained with us, sir. I will now request you to address the audience.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege indeed to be invited to speak to the students and faculty of Symbiosis in the Golden Jubilee here. I think this is a tribute to Dr. Majumdar's vision and, more important, his courage of conviction in building what was a very small idea in 1971 into this vast network of educational institutions. And I think it is something which is worth emulating, whether it's in the field of education or in any other field, by the students of Symbiosis. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to today speak about China and how it looks at the world. In our lifetimes, and in your lifetimes, more importantly, perhaps the most consequential development is the rise of China. It is already the world's second largest economy. At 14 trillion US dollars, it is 2/3 the size of the American economy. And according to every projection, in this decade itself, It will overtake the United States of America to be the largest economy in the world. It is already the largest trading nation in the world. And more interestingly, it is already one of the world's largest outbound investors. In fact, by one statistic, China has already invested close to 350 billion US dollars abroad, which is just shy of the American figure of over $400 billion. And of course, from our personal experience in our daily lives, yours and mine, we all know that China is the world's factory, because many of the products we use are either partly or wholly made in China. China's president, Mr. Xi Jinping, when he spoke at the Party Congress in Beijing in October 2017, he said these words, that in the next 30 years, and I quote, "The next 30 years will be an era that sees China moving closer to the center stage and making greater contributions to mankind," unquote. These 30 years will be your working lifetimes. In short, ladies and gentlemen, we will not be able to imagine, and we cannot imagine, a world without China today. Therefore, a proper understanding of China and how it looks at the world is important. How it intends to adapt and adjust to that world is important. The ways in which it seeks to influence our world and the means and tools that it uses to influence them are also important, not only for the rest of the world, but for our own national well-being, whether it is economic, whether it is political, or whether it is national security. In order to understand how China sees the world, I think it is important to have some insight into how the Chinese see themselves. After all, our foreign policy, the foreign policy of any country, is a reflection of the self, of ourselves. So how do the Chinese see themselves? They see themselves as an ancient and glorious civilization. So do we. They also see themselves as having been a major engine of the global economy for 1,000 years before the year 1800, the Silk Road and all that. And until they were semi-colonized and had to compromise on their territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity when the colonial powers came there in the 19th century, the Chinese were the largest or the second largest economy in the world. And therefore, they carry a deep sense of this history of who they are as a people and what China's rightful place should be in the 21st century. Coupled with this, there is also a strong desire to expunge the memories of what China called its century of humiliation and what others consider to be the sick man of Asia through the 20th century or most of it. So they take great pride in their national rejuvenation as a major economy and as a country with global standing and influence. Now, none of these, their sense of history, their sense of victimhood, and their sense of national pride, none of these are particularly communist in their thinking. But what the Chinese Communist Party has done is very skillfully appropriated these feelings, these innermost desires of the Chinese people, and converted into a narrative which says that only the Communist Party can restore China's historical position. Only the Communist Party can expunge the sense of shame of the past and can ensure that China becomes the world's leading nation by 2050. This, therefore, is the Chinese agenda. Now, it is important for me to underscore here that China is not a normal country. And I wish to give an example in this regard. In 1947, when we gained our independence from the British, the Indian National Congress, which was a party and a political movement also, converted itself into a government by democratic and constitutional means. In other words, it won and lost elections and came in and left office. In contrast, the Chinese Communist Party, when it completed the so-called liberation of China in 1949, became the state itself. In other words, the Communist Party is the People's Republic of China. Whereas our governments have gained legitimacy from the electoral process, the Communist Party did not gain any such legitimacy. Its legitimacy comes from its absolute dictatorship and it's controlled over the armed forces which are loyal to the Communist Party above the nation. And if there is any doubt we had in this regard, then President Xi Jinping, or more correctly, General Secretary of the Communist Party, Mr. Xi Jinping, in a talk that he gave in February 2015, made clear that the absolute rule of the Communist Party is, and I quote, the fundamental point of my country's political stability, economic development, national unity, and social stability, and it must not be shaken in the slightest, unquote. Therefore, I think the Chinese Communist Party and its leader have directly linked the party to the state. And effectively, the party is the guider of all political, economic, and social life in China. Therefore, the party's survival takes precedence over everything else in China. And that is why I say that China is not a normal nation when we deal with them. Now, what is this China that the world has to deal with? 70 years after the so-called liberation, the Communist Party, now under the absolute leadership of Xi Jinping, believes that it has gathered sufficient economic and military power. They use the word comprehensive national strength to describe economic and military power. So they believe that they have acquired enough economic and military power to reclaim this place in the world. As Xi Jinping said in October 2017, the Chinese nation, with an entirely new posture, now stands tall and firm in the East. And today's assessment in China, if you speak to ordinary Chinese, as well as if you read their journals and their statements, today's assessment in China is that both China and the world are in the midst of very fundamental, profound, and complex changes. What President Xi Jinping has called as a once-in-a-century change. And they believe that this profound and complex change the world is undergoing offers China a unique strategic opportunity or a window to achieve two goals, what they call the centenary goals, which is by 2021 to become a moderately well-off society, 2021 being the centenary or 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China next year, and to become the world's leading power by 2049, which is the centenary or 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. The leadership very well understands that this can only be achieved if China continues to grow its economy at least 5.8% per annum each year from next year, 2021, until 2049. Now, this may look to be an easy feat, but it is no easy feat for a country which is already a $14 trillion economy. And what is made even more difficult, why the challenge becomes even more difficult for them, is that it is to grow at that rate with a shrinking population. They are going to peak at 2030 and start declining after that. And the shrinking population means a declining workforce. It means falling household savings and therefore falling government revenues. And it means higher costs for social welfare. Therefore, China has to make fundamental structural changes to its economy. It cannot anymore depend on an export-driven economy. Domestic consumption has to be fueled. It cannot depend on a copy and paste economy, one which reverse engineers or copies somebody else's product. Future prosperity and future revenues and future growth must come from productivity gains linked to innovation. And they have to meet the quality of life expectations of the Chinese people who have been habituated to high growth for a long time. I don't know whether many of you know that from 1977 to 2010, for 33 straight years, China's average rate was 8% per annum or higher in real terms. And therefore, the people expect this to continue. Their well-being and prosperity is linked to it. And this is a challenge for the party. And the party well understands that for their continued survival and legitimacy, because they don't have the legitimacy of an electoral process, the delivery of these objectives are vital. And this ultimately shapes the way China sees the world and the way China acts in the world, which is China's foreign and national security policy. So what is China's worldview? To my mind, it consists of 5 important elements. First, the Chinese believe that the world is shaped by force and power, not by peace and diplomacy. Therefore, China believes it must have the military means to enforce respect and to command obedience. And the Chinese are systematically building this capability. In terms of organizational structures, they have reformed the Central Military Commission. They have modernized their command structure into theater commands. And they have introduced jointness in training and jointness in action. In other words, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army will be able to jointly operate in a seamless manner. In terms of service arms, they've started to build new service arms. They've integrated their entire strategic deterrent force, their missiles, their nuclear weapons, into the PLA rocket force. They have created an entirely new system, a new force called the PLA Strategic Support Force, which integrates their digital, their cyber, and their space warfare capabilities. And like the Americans, they are building a Marine Corps, which in a couple of years, or perhaps 5 or 6 years, will be 100,000 strong men. They are building new weapon systems. Very significant research and development has gone into that. They have stealth aircraft. They have heavy lift aircraft. They are building 3 aircraft carriers. And they have forward bases. For the first time in 2017 and 18, China abandoned its position of 6 decades that it never stations forces on foreign soil when it built its first logistics base in Djibouti in Africa. And of course, they have militarized the islands of the South China Sea. So for all the talk that China does about it not seeking hegemony, about it not wanting to be the dominating power in the world, that is precisely what China is seeking. And the military modernization is an integral part of that plan. Second, the Chinese feel that the United States of America is determined to deny China the chance to rise as a major power, or what the Chinese want to describe as a peaceful rise. Now, initially, the Chinese believed that they could make a proposal to the Americans to form a condominium to jointly manage the world, a kind of G2. And this was the cleverly formulated phrase, major country diplomacy in the new era. These words, the new era, which is being used increasingly by the President Xi Jinping, suggests the 21st century, which is China's era. Of course, Chinese expectations that the West would accommodate and adjust to their rise have not proved to be true. Conversely, Western expectations that the economic prosperity of China would lead to a more liberal political order has also not proved to be true. So China has now changed course with the Americans. It attacks the West for what it calls Cold War thinking and for building alliances. And it has proposed the idea of a community for the shared future of mankind. This is a very vague idea. And ladies and gentlemen, at least my view is that its sole purpose is to entice those who are disillusioned with the West to gather under the Chinese umbrella, with the objective of utilizing the world's support to supplant the West, and particularly the United States, as the dominant power in the existing multilateral system. Third, when China talks of rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, one of the subtexts is the recovery of territory which China believes it had lost or which was seized from it when it was weak in the 19th and early part of the 20th centuries. This, of course, means what they call reunification of Hong Kong and Taiwan, but it also means the recovery of other so-called lost territories, including South Tibet, which is our state of Arunachal Pradesh, the islands of the South China Sea, the islands of the East China Sea, possibly even those territories that they lost to the Russians in the 19th century. This is a core part of Chinese foreign policy. We must understand that. So contrary to its professed position, that it wants to settle disputes through dialogue, that it wants to resolve differences through discussion, recent actions in Ladakh, in the South China Sea, and in Hong Kong point to its real intentions. It is also, of course, securing its periphery by creating a set of buffer states and by establishing a permanent presence not only in the Pacific Ocean, but in the Indian Ocean. Fourth, the Chinese Communist Party understands that its legitimacy, as I said before, depends on the state of the economy, on meeting the people's needs. And it also understands that export-led growth is slowing and is unlikely to revive in the near future, and in any case, unlikely to guarantee a growth rate of 5 to 6% for China for the next 25 years. So China is already building new platforms to compensate for this. And their strategy has two arms: an external arm, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, designed to provide markets in the developing countries for excess domestic capacity, and by using investments to integrate the Asia Pacific into the Chinese economy in a manner somewhat similar to what the United States did with Europe under the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. And the domestic arm of that strategy is what is called Made in China 2025. In other words, to allow domestic industry to qualitatively transform itself by innovating in 10 key areas. And some of these key areas include robotics, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, aerospace, next generation IT, high-speed rail, and so on. And what we are seeing in over the 5G Huawei issue is the first global battle in the challenge that the Chinese are mounting to Western technological domination. And in that process, the Chinese consider it entirely legitimate, entirely fair to utilize their economic dominance to command acceptance from others of their core interests and of their economic and political interests. Fifth and finally, China believes that its national experience recently has proved a fundamental premise of the 20th century to be wrong, namely that democracy is superior to other forms of governance and therefore most conducive for national development. Now, we may recall that in the 20th century, democracy ultimately proved to be sustainable, and it was able to prove it was a better model than the monarchy, subsequently fascism, and last communism in delivering economic and other goods to the people. The Chinese now believe that their national experience over the past 30 years have produced another model. And let me quote President Xi Jinping in this regard. He says, I quote, "China is blazing a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization. It offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up development while preserving their independence, and it offers Chinese wisdom and a Chinese approach to solving the problems facing mankind," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, this is as clear an articulation as you will find that China intends to spread its political influence abroad. They have learned the lessons of the failure of the Soviet Union. They don't intend to export communism as an ideology abroad. But this does not mean that they will not seek to influence and indeed interfere in the internal affairs of others. Therefore, their repeated assertions that China does not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries must not be taken at face value. Recent Chinese efforts to influence the domestic politics in our own neighborhood, those of you who have been reading the papers will know which countries I'm referring to, should be adequate to establish this case. For China, it is of fundamental importance that democracy must be discredited to prove the superiority of the Chinese model of governance, and this is a core objective. Now, all these 5 objectives or elements of their worldview that I outlined has been more than confirmed by the recent outbreak of this public health crisis called COVID-19. Why? Why do I say that? Well, if you situate yourself in the eyes of the Chinese leadership, COVID-19 has confirmed and exposed the deficiencies in American global leadership. It has exposed the disunity of the West. The Europeans and the Americans can't even come together jointly to save the rest of the world. It has, in their view, exposed the inability of democracies to handle the health crisis as efficiently as the Chinese. The Chinese believe that they were able to stamp out this disease effectively within 3 months, whereas many major democracies, including in the advanced countries, are grappling with the problem. And it has uncovered new economic opportunities for the Chinese. They believe their economy has sprung back quicker than the economies of others. And they also think, therefore, that it has given new political and diplomatic space to make China the world's leading nation in the next quarter century. And this, therefore, is how China sees the world. Now, this worldview that the Chinese have major implications for the rest of the world, including for us. And we are already seeing a more assertive and some might say a more aggressive posture, popularly called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they intend to use their national power or comprehensive national strength to persuade and, if required, to coerce nations into bending to their will. So what can we anticipate in the coming 10 years? First, we could expect them to continue talking about a multipolar world, about supporting multipolarity. But we need to watch whether they intend to practice what they preach. The Chinese were ardent supporters of the European Union in the early 2000s. Today, there is every indication that they have abandoned their support for the European project. Whether they actually walk the talk of multipolarity is a thing that we all need to watch out for. Secondly, they talk about a shared future for mankind, win-win cooperation, not getting into a system of alliances, all of us mutually benefiting from each other. Their real intention is balance of power politics. They are no different from any other major power, and they are trying to divide the world between the West and the rest. Thirdly, there is no doubt now that the United States is their major challenge. It always was, almost from the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But now they believe it is a clear and present danger, an existential challenge. And they are fully focused on this challenge. Therefore, every other relationship they have will be tested on the touchstone of China-US relations. It would be, I think, erroneous for anybody to presume that China will determine its behavior towards other countries solely or even largely in a bilateral context or in a bilateral framework. It will be much more in the context of where we stand between China and the United States. In other words, do we help the rise of China or do we hinder the rise of China? And where do we stand with the United States in that effort? Fourthly, China is building a parallel universe. It has already built the first foundations of an alternate trading system, the Belt and Road system. It is trying to create alternate financial institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. It has its own global positioning system, Peito. It has its own digital payment platforms which are entirely dealing from the West, WeChat Pay and Alipay. The 5G network and Huawei is a world-class digital network which can compete with the world's best. And as I explained, the Made in China policy is leading to huge innovation in sunrise industries. Therefore, I want to leave the thought with you that while it is popular belief now that Trump is decoupling from America, in actual fact, in 2013, President Xi Jinping had already, in many ways, especially in the field of technology, already begun the decoupling with the United States. And this trend is going to continue because China's goal is to ensure that the majority of countries adapt to and accept and eventually imbibe Chinese technology and Chinese standards. So the debate on decoupling, to my mind, is a one-sided debate if we only start seeing what happens after President Trump assumed office in 2016. Fifthly, they will insulate as best they can their population from Western influences through digital firewalls. So in addition to providing alternatives to Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, they are also denying their population access to Western social media or in general information outside that which the People's Republic of China's government desires them to see. Whether or not they will succeed is still an open question, but they are using big data in significant ways to do that. But while they are shielding their own population, they continue to use the openness provided by democratic nations to undermine our systems of governance. We should have no two views about this matter. Sixth, their objective is to build the world's most powerful military. Today it is the United States, but by 2030, according to several reliable estimates, including the most recent report released by the Pentagon, America's Department of Defense, last month, by 2030, China will have more ships and submarines, that is surface and subsurface combatants, than the United States and India put together in the Indian Ocean. and therefore a significantly augmented capacity to challenge us in the Indian Ocean. Finally, their objective is to build and ensure that the Communist Party of China is well entrenched to rule China for the rest of the century. And because it is established as legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens by making China the leading power by 2049, this worldview and this goal is critical to the next 25 years if as the Chinese believe that if they can achieve this, then the continued rule of the Communist Party of China beyond 2049 is a given. Now, I want to add a caveat here, lest I've given an impression that we are dealing with a monolithic behemoth which has no flaws. China has also got flaws. Some of them are fundamental flaws. The impression that it is not vulnerable is not correct, but it is more difficult to assess its vulnerabilities because the system is opaque and intransparent. The legitimacy that the Communist Party has is fragile. Democracy gives a government great legitimacy because the people have had a say and will have a say again after 4 or 5 years. In the case of the Communist Party of China, there is no people's mandate and therefore they need to perform. So what we are seeing now in recent months is a new campaign underway to reinforce a message about the centrality of the Communist Party of China to the people of China and to their well-being. In a sense, this suggests there is some concern that people may be having some doubts about whether or not this is the only way forward. Second, the future economic growth of 5.5% or 5.8% that I spoke of is something which is neither easy nor can be taken for granted. Decoupling will also hurt Chinese supply chains. Moreover, it is difficult to encourage domestic consumption. China was already having difficulty doing so in the past 10 years. That problem is going to become even more difficult in the uncertain times that we face in the future after COVID. And the real constraint with China has always been on the demand side, not the supply side. Yet, ironically, in the post-COVID situation, China is pushing the supply side because unless greater production starts, unemployment figures do not come down. Unemployment remains high. So its initial objective is to kickstart production, even if that means overproduction, get people back to the job, and hope for the best that the world begins to consume and the Chinese begin to consume. Of course, that is a big if, and we will know this in the future, but there is a fundamental dichotomy between the Chinese economic policy and its expectations of what might happen post-COVID. Thirdly, of course, while the current leadership of China looks dominant, but history of the Communist Party of China has also shown us that there is resistance and there is opposition and there are more than one point of view within the party. And sometimes this is the top leader is challenged. Therefore, I would suggest that we need to have a much greater study of what is happening inside China. And at least in the last couple of months, news coming out of China about a major drive in the public security and internal security services to cleanse it, as it were, to rectify it, suggests that perhaps even within the security services, there may be some opposition to the regime. Lastly, of course, their very aggressive diplomacy has woken the neighborhood to China's ambition. And the question we all need to ask ourselves is that has China broken cover too soon? Has it attempted to become a world power before all the elements are in position? Now, my concluding point before I stop is that ultimately at the end of all this, as I started out in the beginning by saying, an understanding of China is critical to our national well-being, to your lives. Economic in terms of employment, diplomatic in terms of national security, and in every other way. And serious scholarship is needed if we are to have a proper knowledge of how to handle China, and more importantly, how to secure our space in the world, to how to restore our own position in the world. We cannot avert our eyes from a colossal force that is coming in our direction, nor can we afford to blink. But if we have to stand our ground, we need to prepare ourselves well. And that is the major task for your generation. Thank you very much for listening patiently to me. And thank you once again, Dr. Mazumdar and Dr. Yerudekar for inviting me and giving me this wonderful opportunity to address all of you. Thank you.
Beautiful.
It's an excellent talk. Wonderful.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your insightful speech. I would now like to invite questions. We have received a question from a student from SIBM, Mr. Animesh Kumar. Mr. Animesh Kumar, are you there? Yes, please unmute your mic. Please turn your camera on and please ask your question. Also introduce yourself.
Very good afternoon, sir, Vijay sir. My name is Animesh Kumar, and I am the research scholar at SIBM. Sir, I'm grateful to you that you throw that insights towards the foreign policy, especially towards the country like China. And since you do have the very rich experience pertaining to the foreign affairs, and in a very articulate manner, the way you have discussed about the communist regime of China. In fact, my question is pertaining to the communist rule, sir. So, do you think that the communist rule? Do you think that the communist rule in China is a hurdle in developing a cohesive relationship with other nations, including India? And moreover, sir, it has been blamed, the China has been blamed that the WHO during this pandemic, they were blamed that they were pro-China. The WHO, in fact, yesterday also there was a news that that WTO has says that the US tariffs on China broke global trade rules. So, sir, I just wanted to ask from you, sir. So, what is your perception towards the communist rule? My first question, that whether it is going to help China to build or develop a good relationship with the nations across the world? First question. And second, so do you think that the WHO and the WTO, the bodies, the global bodies, they are pro-China, sir? So this is my question, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Animesh. Animesh, we have to respect the systems of governance in other countries in the same manner that we presume the governments of other countries respect our political choice. Therefore, if the current government of China is a government of the Communist Party of China, I think it is pragmatic diplomacy to deal with them. We have been dealing with them for the last 60 or 70 years, and obviously we have to continue dealing with them. It has not been a hindrance to the development of relations between China and any other country. But I think the moot point here is when a political system of another country begins to interfere in the internal affairs of others, to seek to influence others, to seek to use their openness and transparency to change minds without giving an equal opportunity to the other side, then I think we have to ask ourselves whether we are on a level political and diplomatic playing field. And to the extent that the Chinese Communist Party uses open systems in other countries to try to influence the populations of those countries, and we have seen this in the past, even in India, it does create an obstacle for the improvement of relations. Therefore, my consistent position has been that we expect China to practice what it preaches. And what it preaches is that China never interferes in the internal political affairs of others. We expect them to respect that. We expect them to leave us to deal with our democracy, however imperfect it may be, and to the wisdom of the Indian people to correct the defects. So, in a nutshell, when the Chinese Communist Party is seen to be making moves to influence India's internal politics, it will have an impact on our bilateral relations. The second question is about WHO and COVID. I think we should separate the two issues. One is China's influence in the multilateral system, the UN system, and the other is, of course, what happened in the WHO and COVID. On the second matter, I will not comment because I think an independent panel has been established under the former Prime Minister of Norway and the former President of Liberia, in which India also has an expert, which will go into the whole genesis of the COVID problem and how the world subsequently handled it. But as far as the first one is concerned, the Chinese have very gradually and in a systematic manner enhance their influence in the global multilateral system. No less than 5 of the United States of the UN agencies now, including the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and others, are headed by Chinese. And in a number of others, China has been able to plant its people at high levels. Now, it is perfectly natural for countries, and particularly major countries, and China is a permanent member of the Security Council, to fight an election, win an election, and place its people in UN bodies. But in a non-transparent system of governance, where there is no clear division of powers, there is a concern that the so-called independent experts who are heading these UN bodies are in fact doing the bidding of the government. And therefore, we expect that China should act in a more transparent manner. At the same time, we should prepare for the possibility that the Chinese are seeking to dominate this system. And as a major country, a country in every sense which is major, in terms of population, in terms of geography, and in terms of economy and size, it falls on us also to take a greater responsibility in the United Nations and in the multilateral system to ensure that by our own actions, we maintain some balance.
We will go on to the next question. It's from Radhika Mal. Radhika, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Radhika, please turn your camera on. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I am Radhika Mal from Symbiosis School of International Studies. I'm a second-year student. And my question was, while China propagates its expansionary policy as not something like the unipolar hegemonic order of USA and criticizes USA for having the Cold War ideology, China's action on security issues for other countries, how does it reflect today? Because today's security is not only militaristic, and there are various aspects of security in itself.
Yes, that's a good question, Radhika. As I already said in my talk, the intention of China is to be the dominant power in the world, and that is a hegemony. But we have to understand that, and that is what President Xi Jinping means when he says China is moving to the center of the world stage. But we have to understand that Chinese hegemony may not look like American hegemony. The Chinese, unlike the Americans, are not seeking military domination. I don't think the Chinese want to be the role of the world's policeman. They are an extremely cautious, prudent people. And I don't think they want to undertake, I don't think they have either the desire economically or militarily, or financially or militarily, to take that huge responsibility of policing the world. Nor are they seeking, unlike the West, to be a civilizing influence. The Western colonial powers came to us believing that they would civilize us. American culture essentially wants you to replicate them. They want us to eat McDonald's. They want us to read comic books. They want us to enjoy American TV serials. The Chinese are weak as a soft power. Despite whatever they may say, the Chinese have no desire that the rest of the world replicates them. In fact, they take pride in their exceptionalism. Therefore, their hegemony is a Middle Kingdom hegemony, in which all roads will lead to Beijing for the prosperity of the Chinese people, and whereby accepting the overlordship in an economic sense, by recognizing that their standards, their specifications, their equipment is something we must use, by also believing that their governance model held by the Communist Party is superior, by accepting some of their core concerns, what they define as core concerns, unquestioningly. This is the kind of hegemony they will exercise. And ultimately, they consider themselves to be a benign hegemon. Whether or not others consider it is another matter. So, undoubtedly, they are hegemonic. But if we are expecting them to replicate American hegemony, I think we are going in the wrong direction. We have to change our own thinking based on Chinese readings and Chinese and research on China as to what the Chinese understanding of hegemony is.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So we have a question from our former student, Fatima Kamandi Nasir, who is now in Kabul. And her question is, any fundamental difference between Chinese and Western approach to knowledge about international relations? Why and how?
Yeah, I think that's a question which by in itself deserves a PhD thesis because it's a very fundamental question. I'm very glad you asked that question because very often when we deal with Westerners, they seem to think that India and China are Oriental civilizations and therefore we must be looking at the world in the same way. Actually, we are fundamentally different civilizations. And although we have a narrative which suggests that India and China lived peacefully for 2000 years, the fact is that given our so-called proximity, our contacts with the Chinese and Chinese contacts with us were considerably less than our contacts with Southeast Asia, with Central Asia, and with the Gulf and East Africa. And that is shown in history. So, when I was posted in Taiwan, I explained this to a Taiwanese by giving the example of a river which is flowing in a valley and a rock falls into the river, a large boulder, thereby blocking the natural flow of the river. The average Chinese response is to blow the rock out of the river. The average Indian response is to allow the river to go around the rock and cope with it. In other words, the Chinese, our whole philosophical ethos is that the basic state of human and global nature is chaotic. And we are trying to bring some semblance of order. The Chinese ethos is that it is all orderly under the emperor and the emperor is under heaven. And anything that disrupts that order is highly disturbing. And therefore, their whole effort is to get order back, whereas ours is to deal with chaos. So our own worldview and the worldview of the Chinese is very different. And I explained to you what the Chinese worldview is. Our worldview is very much the worldview, the view that very much the slogan that Dr. Majumdar referred to, which is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is that we grow and others grow with us. And that is the whole ethos of Indian civilization in the centuries past. And even today, that is the ethos of civilization. Now, which will prove to be the superior model is entirely anybody's guess, because while economically it might appear that we are that they are 4 times our size, and while militarily it might appear on paper that they are stronger, the real battle for the hearts and minds of the people will be fought on politics. Is a democratic system of governance where you give the choice to the people to select their leaders, better or worse than a system where the leaders tell the people, we are your government and we are going to give you this kind of a life. So I think the jury is out on that.
Thank you very much, sir. We have time only for one more question, and that is from Arpan Rathi. Arpan, are you there?
Hello. Yeah. Good evening to all of you. Myself, Arpan Rathi, and I'm an alumnus of Symbiosis School of International Studies. So my question is, why India is apprehensive in having relationship with Taiwan, and also throw light on the relevance of Quad in the coming years? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. In 1949, our government, the government of the day, our first Prime Minister, took a decision to recognize the People's Republic of China. By then, the nationalist Chinese government had been defeated and it had fled the mainland to establish itself in Taiwan. And it was the worldview of our first Prime Minister that China was not only an important neighbor, but historically had been a global player, and we needed to establish that relationship. And this is a policy that we have consistently followed for the past 7 decades. Since that decision was taken, through thick and through thin, and through different governments belonging to different political parties. Now, the issue here is that the rest of the world has subsequently followed suit. Virtually no country today recognizes Taiwan as an independent country, barring a few selected countries in South Pacific or some in Latin America. So in other words, you could say in one sense that the trend of history was in one direction, and perhaps we were among the early people to get onto that trend. That is notwithstanding the fact, however, that we have other normal, non-governmental relations with Taiwan. We have a trade office there. Our trade is $7 billion. We are getting major Taiwanese investment into India. We the fact that we don't have diplomatic or political relations has not in any way hampered our signing agreements. For instance, we have a double taxation agreement with them. We have a civil aviation agreement with them, which allowed flights before this COVID situation occurred, which allowed flights to operate between Taipei and Indian cities. We have a customs agreement with them because movement of goods is essential. We have a number of agreements with them. We have a number of prestigious Taiwanese companies investing in India. And for that purpose, we have comings and goings of people to help out in that, and officials on both sides understand the importance of investment and of economic activity. So I'm trying to distinguish between what is a formal diplomatic recognition, in which we are not alone, but we are actually with the rest of the world in having recognized that Taiwan is a part of China. But on the other hand, we are also not shy of developing all the other kinds of relationships that any country develops normally with another, and which allows for normal economic activity, for people-to-people movement and so on to take place. Excuse me. Where Quad is concerned, and that's an excellent question because it's a very timely one. Look, the situation is as follows. The Prime Minister in June 2018 unveiled the Indo-Pacific strategy. This is a strategy which is India-centric. Let us not forget that India's wealth and prosperity for 2 millennia before 1800 did not come from the Indo-Gangetic plain. That was the granary of India. Where did our wealth come from? It came from the coast, from Gujarat, from the Carnatic, from Malabar, from Coromandel, and from Bengal. These were where the wealth was generated. Therefore, our orientation has to go back to the sea. And this is what the Prime Minister talked about. Quad is one mechanism. It's not the Indo-Pacific strategy. It is plurilateral mechanism. It's no different from Russia, India, China. It's no different from BRICS. It's no different from ASEAN and so on. Therefore, if there is anybody which has an objection to that plurilateral mechanism, we should explain to them that this is not an Indo-Pacific strategy. This is one platform on which to talk. But we must not give any country a veto. After all, does China not have mechanisms in the region? It has a quadrilateral mechanism on our border between Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and China. Are we to assume that that is directed against us? So I think there's a certain amount of maturity both sides have to show. And the Chinese have to understand that India is an independent government and is an independent country with a policy of strategic autonomy, has the right to follow its interests, and that one of these interests is with 3 or more other countries which share values and which exchange views on how we overall maintain stability, peace, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. That is not tantamount to saying it is immediately against China. And if the Chinese believe that, then I think they need to be explained that this has nothing to do with.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
One last question. Sir, if you may permit me to allow just one more question. There's one from Aniket. Aniket, over to you.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. My question to you is, do you think that the root cause of Chinese aggressiveness on the Sino-Indian border is associated with the actions of the Indian government on October 5th, 2019? Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that question, Aniket. I am convinced that it has nothing to do with the action that we took on the 5th of August or the 6th of August 2019. On the 6th of August 2019, the Parliament of India, the 2 houses of Parliament, approved a bill for the internal reorganization of a state of India into 2 union territories. Now, the internal reorganization did not change the external boundaries. It did not change our map, and nor did it change the Chinese map. The Chinese map continues to show the boundary where it does. Our map continues to show the boundary where it is, as we claim it. And our map only changes what is inside India. That is the sovereign right of our republic. But let me also put forward this argument. This is not the first time that we have changed the map. After all, in the year 2000, Uttar Pradesh also became Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand consists of the middle sector of the India-China boundary. Did China protest at that time? Was the situation any different? So we have to ask ourselves, is this the genuine reason or is this the pretext? And to my mind, it is very clear it is a pretext. We have not changed the external boundaries. We have not made new claims. We have simply done internal administrative reorganization. If the Chinese wish to use this pretext to justify what they are doing, I don't think the people of India are going to buy this.
Thank you, sir.
So may I ask one question? I have a burning question for you.
Sure.
You spoke about firewalling, you spoke about the Chinese firewalling their population, particularly by blocking social media sites like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. But how would you explain the burgeoning numbers of young Chinese people, particularly in Western universities, like a Cambridge or a Sciences Po in Paris, because you see a lot of Chinese students. So would you be able to explain that trend?
Look, the Chinese, like Indians, set great store by education. Families save up money to give education to their children, and many of them are willing to scrimp and save to send their children abroad. It's no different from an average Indian family, to give the child the best education they can. Now, the Chinese are also a people who believe that a good education leads to employment. And therefore, when they go abroad, like Indians, they work hard and they earn a name for themselves. What is happening now, however, is that the Chinese are returning to their homeland in perhaps larger numbers than Indians are, because the economic opportunities at home are huge. And because they find that year on year, the growth in their incomes and the growth in their lifestyle is more or less commensurate with that of the United States. And they are now, therefore, a second generation of Chinese are growing up in China, which have had the benefit of their teachers having foreign education, but who are themselves educated in China. So I think, and let us not make a mistake, we seem to think that the moment an average non-American student goes to the United States, we immediately imbibe their ideology and way of life. That's a wrong way of thinking. Most Indians don't do that either. Many Indians still cling to their Indianness, even if they become Indian Americans, and so do the Chinese. So if there is an impression that by getting the Chinese students to the United States are going to change their mind, I respectfully beg to disagree. They return to China proudly with a Princeton or Yale education, but determined to make China the center of the world. And I think Indians also increasingly are coming back with a degree from the United States, determined to make a new India. So I think the West perhaps is misreading the situation if it thinks that it is inculcating liberal political values in Chinese by educating them in American universities.
Thank you. So while we do have more questions, I think we're just going to have another session with you. It's been an absolute delight for all of us, but particularly for the international relations, international studies students and faculty. May I now please request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rajni Gupte, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shivali. Thank you, Shivali. Respected Dr. S.B. Mazumdar, the Chancellor of the Symbiosis International University and the founder of Symbiosis, Dr. Vidya Yeravdekar, the Pro-Chancellor of the Symbiosis International University, our esteemed guest for the Golden Jubilee Lecture Series, Shri Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, Shivali, all the deans, directors, faculty, staff, alumni, and dear students. Let me first express my deep sense of gratitude to Mr. Vijay Gokhale for his absolutely brilliant session on how China sees the world. All of us are aware that when it comes to China, practically everyone has an opinion, even the man on the street. Comparing India and China is a favorite topic, and with the recent removal of the Chinese apps and the incursion on the Indian border, China is very much in the news. Much has also been written about China, US-China trade war, and the ambitions of China to become a world leader. All of this, however, is the way the world sees China. Mr. Gokhale, you, however, presented a very interesting insight into how China sees the world. You spoke about the rise of China, a $14 trillion economy, and that in this decade it will overtake the US. You also emphasized that it's important for our national well-being to understand China very well. China sees itself as an ancient power and has a deep sense of history and of their rightful place in the world. And in this context, the Communist Party narrative has been that China can lead the world, and its emphasis on the comprehensive national strength to reclaim its position in the world. You also mentioned that the profound changes in the world in recent times has provided a window for China, and that by 2049, the centenary year, China hopes to be the leading power in the world. But however, you caution that growing at the pace that they have done with a shrinking population will be a challenge. They cannot any longer remain export driven. They need to enhance productivity and also their quality of life. I particularly liked your words on the China's worldview, how they view force and power, how they believe that the US is denying them a chance to be the world leader. And therefore, they're collecting countries, or they're collecting those who are disgruntled with the West. The recovery of their lost territory has again been very, very prominent. Chinese Communist Party and its Belt and Road Initiative was also mentioned, and the Made in China 2021 initiative, which is a tech domination being the main theme over there. And finally, you also talked about how they do not believe that democracy is the solution for economic growth. The way their economy has functioned is what they would like to bring to the rest of the world. You also linked it to the current COVID crisis and how China has gained space. You mentioned the flaws that need to be washed as we go ahead. Mr. Gokhale, your talk has indeed added another dimension to the way one views China. It is truly a formidable force to reckon with in the new era. Thank you ever so much for graciously spending time with our young students, answering their questions and motivating them. Thank you for inviting Mr. Gokhale. Thank you, Dr. Muzumdar, for your gracious presence. Before I end, let me also thank Animesh Kumar, Radhika, the two alumni from Afghanistan, Fatima and Hassan, and Aniket for all those wonderful questions. Let me also thank the tech team, which has been behind this wonderful session. Thank you ever so much, Mr. Gokhale. We do look forward to you being with us. I'm sure there are 100 more questions which will need your patient answers. So we do look forward to you coming back to Symbiosis at the very earliest opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.